It was generally agreed, at least by those inhabitants of Little Brackenby who prided themselves on not being of the village, that the late Reverend Septimus Pendlebury had died in an excessively uncomfortable position for a man of his cloth. Found with his face pressed awkwardly against the brass fender of his own drawing-room hearth, his cassock scorched in a neat semicircle about the knees, and one arm outstretched toward the French windows, which were, curiously, locked from the inside, the vicar presented a tableau oddly reminiscent of a medieval martyrdom, albeit one performed in sensible slippers and with a faint scent of cough lozenges in the air. The discovery had been made by Miss Tryphena Crouch, organist and unashamed Nosy Parker, who had entered via the back scullery under the pretext of delivering 2 jars of quince jelly and an overdue edition of the Church Times. She did not scream, but rather said, as she later told everyone who would listen, "Oh, now really," and promptly sat down in the nearest wing chair, ignoring the discomfited corpse and instead focusing on the vicarage cat, an ancient black creature named Ozymandias, who was perched silent and unmoving atop the escritoire. He had been there, according to Miss Crouch, for hours, guarding, as it were, the scene of the crime, when Lord Peter Wimsey arrived 2 days later, wearing a camel-hair coat, a look of unseasonable cheer, and a spotted cravat that had once caused Lady Sybil Fankling to faint at Ascot. The corpse had long since been spirited away to the mortuary in Low Markham, and the cat had resumed his customary indifference to all matters temporal. Wimsey arrived not because he had been summoned. Inspector Tewkesbury of the County Constabulary prided himself on having no need of amateur aristocratic assistance, but rather because he had received a letter. More accurately, he had received 3, 2 from mutual acquaintances, one from the Bishop of Worplesdon, who ended his note with a Latin quotation that Wimsey would later annotate rather sniffily as mendacious Virgil, misplaced participle. The letters all said roughly the same thing. Something rather off about Pendlebury's death, unlikely man to fall on a fire, village uneasy, no one speaks plainly, Tryphena C. saw something odd. Also, cat. Wimsey, of course, was interested, not in the vicar's demise per se, but in the way the matter was being handled, delicately, distantly, as though the whole affair had happened not in the snug sitting-room of the vicarage, but in a mildly disreputable Greek tragedy. "Death by domestic arrangement," he murmured, glancing round the neat garden path. "It's the most ghastly way to go, makes everyone around you terribly uncomfortable." Bunter, arriving just behind with the cases, said nothing. He merely glanced toward the windows, noting with professional detachment the clean brass latches and the slight imbalance in the curtain rods, one of which leaned, infinitesimally, inward. Inside, Wimsey was met by the housekeeper, Mrs. Manley, whose knitted cardigan looked as though it might collapse into an existential funk at any moment. She offered tea, which Wimsey declined with a courteous smile, but asked instead if he might have a look at the hearth. "Mr. Pendlebury was a man of habit, I take it?" he asked, kneeling by the grate and examining the fender with what Mrs. Manley later described as positively romantic attention. "Oh yes," she replied. "Evenings were always the same. Tea at 6, sermon notes after, fire lit at 7 sharp. He'd never leave it untidy. That poker there, he never moved it." Wimsey's fingers hovered over the poker but didn't touch. He glanced up toward the cat, who had again assumed his position atop the desk and was now watching the visitor with sphinx-like disdain. "Ozymandias," Wimsey said aloud, "king of cats and lords of nothing." The cat blinked once as though unimpressed. Bunter had, by this point, examined the French window. Locked, no signs of tampering. One key in the drawer, none on the vicar's person. "One supposes, my lord, that he would not have locked himself in and then fallen over the fire by mistake." "Not without assistance," Wimsey replied thoughtfully, "though one cannot underestimate the tragic potential of cassock and carpet." He stood, brushing ash from his knees. His expression was mild, but something had sparked behind the eyes, a familiar glint that suggested he had already, in some murky corner of his mind, begun drawing diagrams. As he stepped into the hall, he paused beside the grandfather clock. It ticked demurely, the way all good clocks do in a vicarage, but Wimsey frowned. "That's interesting," he said. Very interesting. Tell me, Mrs. Manley, was it always 10 minutes slow? Mrs. Manley blinked. I never noticed, my lord. I don't think so. No, and yet it runs as though it's been slow for quite some time, which rather suggests that someone had no wish for the time to be known, at least not accurately. He smiled again, brighter this time. We shall, Bunter, consult the cat more fully later. For now, let us walk the village. There is, I think, something unusually unpleasant, hiding beneath all this respectable upholstery. Ozymandias, unmoving, watched them go, his green eyes unblinking, as if he already knew the end of the story. Lord Peter Wimsey's stroll through Little Brackenby was less a promenade and more an inspection under the guise of idle curiosity. He walked with his hands clasped lightly behind his back, head tilted at a slightly absurd angle, as if deciphering the inner thoughts of hedgerows. Villagers, instinctively aware of the presence of an outsider who could not be easily ignored, offered nods of cautious civility or disappeared suddenly into side gardens. It was Bunter, ever diplomatic in both service and surveillance, who suggested they first visit the churchwarden, Mr. Elphinstone, retired solicitor, widower, and amateur cultivator of delphiniums. A man, my lord, who hears more than he says and remembers more than he should, was Bunter's summation. Wimsey acquiesced with a theatrical sigh. Let us go and knock on the gates of the law, then, and see what blooms there, aside from delphiniums. Mr. Elphinstone's cottage sat across from the churchyard, a stone's throw from the vicarage, and presumably close enough for him to witness, if not the fall itself, then certainly the pattern of comings and goings. He opened the door in shirt-sleeves, spectacles low on his nose, and regarded them with the faint suspicion of a man who has lived too long in the company of other men's sins. Yes, I saw the lights that evening, he said. Once pleasantries had been conducted and chairs offered in a drawing-room that smelled faintly of old legal volumes and beeswax polish. The sitting-room curtains were drawn, but there was a flickering. Odd, I thought, as it was just past 8, and Septimus always extinguished the fire by past. Wimsey, who had been examining a porcelain shepherdess with one eye and watching Elphinstone's carpet-wearing spaniel with the other, turned his attention back to the old man. Punctual to a fault, was he? Fires out by the half-hour. Every evening, habit, he'd say, a man may contemplate eternity with hot cocoa, but never with hot embers. Rather over-fond of quoting himself was old Septimus, but yes, by 8:30, never a flame. And what time did you notice the flickering? 8:15, give or take a minute. That's when I close my own shutters. And I remember because the wireless had just finished the weather report. Promised fog. It came too. Wimsey nodded. Fog is an excellent curtain. One might commit all manner of indiscretions in fog, provided one knows the path. He turned to Bunter. We shall make a note of that. 8:15, fire still burning, which is awkward, considering the post-mortem suggests death occurred closer to 7:45. Rather puts the poor vicar in the awkward position of stoking the fire some time after his heart ceased beating. Elphinstone did not blink. You suspect murder, then? I suspect manners, Wimsey replied, standing. And in such settings, murder is almost always a matter of manners, someone failing to behave in the way they were meant to. Good evening, Mr. Elphinstone. You've been as precise as an affidavit and twice as illuminating. Their next stop was the village shop, where Miss Tryphena Crouch dispensed gossip as precisely as she did flour and treacle. She was not flustered by the sight of a titled gentleman inquiring about cats and clergy. On the contrary, she took it as further proof of the late vicar's spiritual significance that his death had drawn so aristocratic an inquiry. He was afraid, Lord Peter, she said, with a certain grim satisfaction. Oh, yes, he said nothing aloud, but he was not at peace these past 3 weeks. Started keeping the doors locked all day, which he never did before, said it was burglaries in Low Markham. But I knew he was frightened of someone close. Wimsey, extracting a toffee from the jar with exaggerated ceremony, said mildly, Someone in the village? Miss Crouch's eyes glittered behind her spectacles. You don't keep doors locked at tea-time for fear of strangers. Indeed, Wimsey murmured, and I suppose you would not recall if the vicar ever wrote letters after supper. He was left-handed, wasn't he? He was. Odd sort of slant he had, like everything leaned uphill. Yes, I posted several for him just last week. One to the diocesan office and one, I think, to a woman. Pale blue envelope, not local. Was the name Catherine by any chance? Asked Whimsy. He smiled faintly when she blinked in surprise. Ah, curious what cats remember. Thank you, Miss Crouch. As they exited, Bunter said quietly, Your lordship hasn't yet mentioned a Miss Catherine. Nor shall I, not yet, Whimsy replied. But when a vicar begins corresponding with a woman he will not name to his housekeeper in pale blue envelopes and keeps his doors locked against his parishioners, one suspects matters more complicated than misplaced doctrine. They returned to the vicarage, the fog having settled by then in slow curling tendrils along the garden wall. Inside, the drawing-room remained as it had earlier, curtains still askew, hearth-swept, Ozymandias still perched like an unwilling sentinel. Whimsy stood before the fireplace again and stared at the andiron. Bunter, he said slowly, do you notice something peculiar about the ash pattern? Bunter knelt, squinting at the grate. One side has more soot than the other, my lord, as though the fire was raked in only from the left. Exactly. Which Septimus would never have done, being left-handed. That would place the poker at an awkward angle. So either our vicar changed lifelong habits in a final fit of asymmetry, or someone else tended the fire after his death. He turned toward the escritoire. The letters are gone, Miss Crouch said too, but the desk is oddly barren, not the sort of place one clears unless one knows what to look for. May I suggest, said Bunter, that someone with a key to this house arrived after his death, cleared the writing desk, tended the fire, and locked the French doors behind them. You may indeed. But how did they leave unless they exited through the front, past Mrs. Manley, who insists she was in the kitchen all evening? Ozymandias, perhaps in protest at being interrogated without so much as a saucer of milk, leapt lightly from the escritoire and disappeared down the hall. Whimsy turned, following him. Let us allow the cat to guide us, Bunter. He has, I suspect, been guarding more than just the drawing-room. The hall led to a study rarely used, and from there to a small storeroom Whimsy had noted earlier only in passing. The door creaked slightly as he opened it. Inside was the expected bric-a-brac of vicarage life, old hymnals, rolled-up parish banners, a teetering umbrella stand. But to the left, obscured behind a tall oak prie-dieu, was a narrow servant's stair. Now, Whimsy murmured, his voice laced with admiration, that is a rather lovely trick, forgotten by most, no doubt, but not by someone who once lived, or served here. He ascended, each creak of the step speaking volumes. The stair emerged, as he suspected, in the corridor beside the spare guest room, a corridor not visible from the front hall, and one that gave access to both the study and the drawing-room via the small book alcove. A person could move through the vicarage unseen if they knew the house well enough, and someone had. He turned back to Bunter, who had followed silently. Our killer knew this stair, knew Septimus's habits, and perhaps knew the letters he was writing would bring everything down. Whimsy glanced once more toward the main stairs. But what troubles me, Bunter, is that the only person who could have used this passage without arousing suspicion is someone no longer living here. Bunter raised an eyebrow. You suspect? Are the dead, my lord? No, said Whimsy. I suspect someone who has tried very hard to appear dead, to memory if not to record. He smiled, sharp and sudden. And I think it's time we made further inquiries into the mysterious Miss Catherine, the one who left, and perhaps came back. By the following morning the fog had lifted, though only from the fields and hedgerows. In Little Brackenby itself, it lingered stubbornly in the minds of its inhabitants, curling around memory and speculation like pipe smoke in a closed room. Lord Peter Whimsy, breakfasting lightly on toast and reading aloud from the Times with unconcealed boredom, waited only for Bunter to reappear from a quiet fact-finding stroll through the village before turning his attention, as one might to a crossword, to the matter of the mysterious Miss Catherine. It was not long before Bunter returned, immaculate as ever despite a morning spent charming grocers and postmistresses. He handed over a small slip of notepaper with a penciled address. Catherine Leyburn, former schoolmistress, lived here until 3 years ago, then a sudden move to Bournemouth. According to Mrs. Cratchley of the post office, there were murmurs. To have some disgrace, Nothing said aloud, but the sort of thing people knew not to ask after. Miss Leyburn never married, highly respectable family. Her father was the previous vicar, my lord. Wimsey raised an eyebrow. Which makes our Miss Leyburn not just familiar with the vicarage, but practically ecclesiastical nobility. He turned the slip between his fingers. 3 years gone, and yet her name appears again, on envelopes no less. Pale blue, suggestive of femininity and possibly reconciliation. But one does not write in pale blue unless one hopes the contents will be taken gently. Indeed, my lord, and the letters she sent were not posted, they were dropped into the village box. Hand-delivered, I'm told. Wimsey's fingers drummed lightly on the armrest of his chair. Which means Miss Leyburn, or someone using her name, was here. Recently and in person. After a moment's pause, he rose with abrupt energy. We shall call on Miss Leyburn. Or rather, we shall discover whether Miss Leyburn remains a person of this world or only of lingering letters. But Wimsey did not make directly for Bournemouth. That would have been entirely too tidy, and besides, he had not yet properly visited Inspector Tewkesbury. The inspector received him at the modest station house, with the kind of wary civility reserved for guests one cannot technically refuse. Tewkesbury, a square man with a square moustache, bore a faint resemblance to a brick wall, resilient, weathered, and faintly resentful of art. I'm obliged to let you look over the file, Lord Peter, but I must say I don't see the necessity. The coroner was clear. Natural causes, heart gave out, bit of a shock, but the man was 68 and overly fond of brandy. Brandy and habit, I'm told, Wimsey said, examining the file's cover with reverence. One's passions often conflict in the end. He flicked through the pages quickly, eyes darting to the autopsy. Heart failure, yes, but no significant arterial blockage. Mild arrhythmia. It doesn't scream inevitability. More of a whisper. Wouldn't you say? Tewkesbury folded his arms. No sign of foul play, no trauma, no toxins. Just dropped like a stone. But after tending the fire, which he had never done that late before, and with the writing desk neatly cleared, the letter drawer entirely barren, and a clock 10 minutes off schedule. You're reading ghosts into gossip, Lord Peter. Wimsey's smile was almost apologetic. Perhaps, but when a man who never leaves his fire burning does so for the first and final time, and a woman with a pale blue pen returns from exile to post untraceable letters, I begin to suspect that the ghost in question is quite real, and recently employed a train ticket. The inspector allowed this to pass in silence. As they left the station, Bunter handed Wimsey a telegram that had arrived during their visit. It bore the Bournemouth postmark and read, Catherine Leyburn, deceased 2 years. Sister now in possession. House, no letters in her hand since 1928. Stop. Solicitor. Wimsey stared at the paper for several seconds. Then he folded it slowly. Well, he said, that simplifies one matter and complicates 6 others. Someone is using her name, or someone perhaps never truly let her go. And so the red herring arrived in its traditional form, tragic, convenient, and altogether dead. They returned to the vicarage that afternoon, under a sky now darkening with real storm clouds. There they found Mrs. Manley waiting in some agitation, clutching what appeared to be a folded flyer for the parish jumble sale. It's not much, my lord, she said, but it was stuck behind the clock. I was dusting as usual, and it dropped. Out. Thought it might be something. It was something, not a letter, but a corner torn from a blue envelope. On it, only a fragment of a name and a partial address in sloping script. Burn, Dorset. Far too little to post, said Bunter. But just enough to know, said Wimsey. Miss Leyburn did not write this. Someone else forged her name and tore this off to avoid detection. He tucked the fragment away. There's a person in this village who has kept a secret for years, perhaps even decades. Who knew of Catherine, of Septimus, and of something that passed between them, once too long ago for polite people to speak of. And now that person has made a very grave mistake. It was not until late that evening, long after tea and the tedious note-taking of the day's observations, that the mistake revealed itself more fully. Bunter, polishing a pair of Wimsey's cufflinks with particular reverence, said, I've compiled the movements of the key villagers on the night of the vicar's death. Most were accounted for. But Miss Judith Fellows, the schoolmistress, Wimsey asked. Yes, my lord, lives at the far end of the village, claimed she was marking papers all evening, but the postmistress recalls she posted a letter just after 8 and was flustered. Not unusual in itself, but she dropped a handkerchief, pale, blue, embroidered CL. Whimsy's eyes narrowed slightly. Judith Fellows. Of course, she took over the school the year Catherine left, close in age, possibly even acquainted, and would know how to imitate her hand. He leaned back in the chair and steepled his fingers. She did not kill the vicar, no, I don't believe that. But she knows something, and more than that, she attempted to mislead, just enough to point us away from someone else. Someone she's protecting? Whimsy nodded. Or someone she fears. Let us walk tomorrow, Bunter. I have a feeling. Miss Fellows is ready to be asked the right question, and I believe that question begins not with what she wrote, but with what she destroyed. As the wind began to hiss faintly against the window panes, and the old grandfather clock ticked 10 slow beats behind the hour, Ozymandias crept once again into the drawing-room and resumed his post by the hearth, still and silent, watching. The empty chair with narrowed eyes, as if expecting the vicar to return and settle the matter himself. The next morning dawned with a sharp, clean light that poured through the vicarage windows, as if determined to scrub the place of all ambiguity. Lord Peter Wimsey, however, remained quite unmoved by the weather's efforts, lounging at the breakfast table with the sort of idle grace that only the genuinely alert can manage. His eggs, untouched, had congealed into a pale reflection of enthusiasm, while his fingers toyed with a slip of paper that bore the remnants of yesterday's envelope fragment. Judith Fellows, he murmured aloud, the name tasting faintly of chalk and long afternoons. Protective, secretive, but not, I think, murderous. The forgery was clever, but not clever enough. What would she risk exposure for, I wonder? Or whom? Bunter, as ever precise in pouring the coffee, answered only with the calm placement of a sugar bowl. It was nearly 10 before they reached Miss Fellows's cottage, a narrow, weather-beaten structure with a hedge that looked resentful of trimming. The schoolmistress herself opened the door, face set in the manner of a person who has rehearsed her lines, then misplaced the script entirely. She was in her early 40s, sharp-featured, with eyes that had once been large enough to express wonder, but now served mostly to detect poor grammar. Her blouse was buttoned one loop too high, and her hands, Whimsy noted, trembled slightly as she pushed them into her pockets. "Lord Peter," she said, "I thought, well, no matter, please come in." The cottage was as he expected, orderly, bookish, bleak. No ornaments, no photographs, and only the faintest trace of lavender in the air, as if the scent, too, had been reduced to discipline. "I'm sorry to intrude, Miss Fellows," Whimsy began gently, "but we're following a rather unorthodox trail of correspondence. It seems someone in the village has been writing letters under an assumed name, Catherine Leyburns to be precise." Judith stiffened almost imperceptibly. "I see. How unfortunate." "For whom?" he asked, watching her carefully. "For Miss Leyburn, who cannot protest, or for the recipient who may have hoped she had written them in earnest?" She did not reply immediately. Instead, she moved toward the writing desk, her fingers hovering over its surface, as if debating the wisdom of touching anything. "She was my friend," Judith said at last. "Once. Before everything went wrong." "You forged her hand," Whimsy said without reproach. "And posted letters to Septimus Pendlebury." She nodded once. "I wanted to help him forgive, to heal. They had been close many years ago, but something happened, a betrayal. He never spoke of it, and neither did she, but I think he carried it like a thorn in the soul. And you thought a letter might remove it?" "I thought," she said, voice brittle, "that if he believed she had reached out, he might sleep easier. I didn't think he'd die." Whimsy regarded her in silence for a moment. "Did you clear the writing desk after?" "No," she said, the word loud and ragged. "I swear I never went back after posting the letter. I couldn't face him." "And yet someone did. Someone who knew your letter was a forgery, or at least suspected. Someone who feared what it might awaken." Judith looked at him, a flicker of understanding dawning slowly. "You think the letter didn't comfort him? You think it frightened him?" "I think," Whimsy said, rising. That someone made. Sure he would never read another. As they left the cottage, Bunter handed him a folded note taken from the village constable. The inspector sent this along. A report just came back. Fingerprint analysis from the poker. Prints belonged to Septimus, yes, but also to someone else. Not a servant. No, my lord, one match, Mr. Harry Kettle. Ah, said Whimsy with mild interest. Our village handyman, known for his discretion, unreliable moustache, and irrational dislike of cats. He folded the note slowly. Let us, Bunter, pay a call on Mr. Kettle, the man who repairs windows and hearts and likely knows the secret doors of every house in Little Brackenby. They found Kettle at the tool shed behind the rectory hall, repairing a wheelbarrow with the solemnity of a surgeon. He was a short man, built squarely, with hands that looked like they had once quarrelled with granite and won. When Whimsy introduced himself, Kettle gave only a grunt. You knew the Reverend well, I take it? Whimsy began. Well enough, said Kettle, not looking up. Did his locks, painted the sills, fixed that French window after a storm last March. Did you have access to the house recently? Kettle's hand stilled. No. No. And, yet your prints are on the poker. At that the man looked up. His eyes were unexpectedly bright, clear as lake water. That was weeks ago. He asked me to fetch it. Something in the grate. Dead bird. A curious task for a vicar to assign. Didn't. Like touching soot, said Kettle flatly. Said it gave him a rash. And what did you see that day? Kettle hesitated. He looked tired. Off his feed, wouldn't say why. Whimsy nodded. Did you see anyone else come or go around the house that week? Anyone unusual? There was a pause. Then, a man in a brown coat, tall, thin. I saw him come out the back gate one evening. Thought he was just one of those diocesan types. Which evening, can't rightly say. Could have been Monday, could have been Tuesday, but he didn't knock. Back at the vicarage, Whimsy sat again before the hearth. The poker, now safely under wraps in a brown envelope, seemed to mock him with its dull gleam. Let us review, he said. Someone enters via a forgotten stair, removes letters from the desk, tends the fire, leaving prints on the poker, locks the doors behind them. All while Septimus lies dead. Perhaps before, perhaps after this mysterious visitor's arrival. And the motive, my lord? Asked Bunter. Whimsy tapped a finger against his temple. Ah, that is the puzzle, isn't it? What drives one to reframe death? Not inheritance. Septimus had no estate to speak of, not jealousy. It would be decades. Too late for that. No, Bunter, I think we are dealing with something more delicate, reputation, or perhaps silence. He turned toward the stair. The French window was locked, but someone used the servants' passage. Someone who knew this house from long ago and feared what might come to light if Septimus began to speak again. And you suspect the man in the brown coat? I suspect him of being not diocesan at all, but familial. We must inquire into Catherine Laban's surviving relatives. I think we shall find a brother, or perhaps a nephew, with reasons old enough to bury and desperate enough to kill again, if needed. He rose then, smiling faintly. I say, Bunter, shall we have tea before we confront a man over the murder of a clergyman by means of silence, forgery, and a carefully stoked fire? I find strong accusations benefit greatly from a scone. Ozymandias, now curled upon the vicar's vacant armchair, opened one eye briefly and closed it again, as if unimpressed by either the pacing or the deduction. But Whimsy merely bowed slightly to the cat and strode off down the hall, humming a bar from Don Giovanni with entirely too much pleasure for a man about to unearth a buried scandal. The scone, when it arrived, was tragically overbaked, but Lord Peter consumed it with such deliberation that one might have suspected it held some forensic value. He ate in silence, allowing his thoughts to steep alongside the lukewarm tea, his fingers absently drumming the rim of the china as if marking time not to any rhythm in the room, but to something elusive. The ticking of guilt, perhaps, or the silence between remembered footsteps. At last he spoke, not to Bunter, but into the air. There's something false in the timeline, something positioned too neatly, a narrative so clean it begins to feel scrubbed. Bunter, clearing the tray, raised an eyebrow. Which element, my lord? All of it. Whimsy said, rising and walking to the hearth. Septimus dies just after 7:45, so says the coroner, but the fire burns until 8:15, says Elphinstone, yet no witness reports seeing anyone arrive or leave. Letters are missing, a poker wiped only partially clean, and someone knew of a stair that no living servant uses. He walked to the grandfather clock, still 10 minutes behind, and opened the glass face. This clock is not simply slow. It was deliberately adjusted, a quarter turn on the minute wheel, no more. To shift the chime, someone wanted it to read 10 minutes behind at a very specific moment. He pulled a notebook from his coat and flipped it open to a series of tightly written times. Let us reconstruct. 6:45. Pendlebury finishes tea. Mrs. Manley retires to the kitchen. 7. He lights the fire, breaks habit, writes a letter, possibly prompted by the forged one. 7:30. Judith's letter, falsely from Catherine, is presumed delivered. He likely reads it then. It would have struck him. 7:45, the estimated time of death. Yet the fire is still fresh at 8:15. Someone enters afterward. Why? Because the letter from Judith, if left behind, was dangerous. If others found it, the deception would be obvious. The forgery had to be removed. Bunter nodded. And the timeline changed. Exactly, Whimsy said, turning with sudden energy. The visitor, let's call him the brown coat, enters through the back, perhaps using the servant's stair. He finds Septimus already dead or dying. He clears the letter, adjusts the clock, rakes the fire to confuse the coroner as to how long it had burned, and locks the door behind him. The police assumed natural causes. The fire's presence wasn't questioned. Quite. But if Septimus had died hours earlier, the fire would be out, which suggests our brown coat hoped to anchor death closer to 8, not 7:45. The manipulation is subtle, but it's there. Bunter stepped to the window, pulling back the curtain. Do you believe he was seen? Unlikely. The fog was thick, and the back stair gives onto the vicar's private study, no visible approach. It's a nearly perfect route for someone once familiar with the house, someone like, he paused, Thomas Leyburn, Catherine's brother, mentioned once by Elphinstone as something of a recluse, unwell in the mind after service in Egypt. Last seen in Brackenby 12 years ago, but I checked the registers yesterday. His name reappeared twice in 1929. Briefly, then vanished. Could have changed his name, Bunter said, or been hidden deliberately, Whimsy replied. Protected. Perhaps by someone like Judith Fellows, who was Catherine's closest friend and might feel obliged to keep the family's troubles hidden. He turned again to the hearth. But if Thomas returned to Brackenby and learned of the forged letter of Catherine's name being used, he may have panicked. Thought Septimus would expose something, or perhaps it wasn't panic. Perhaps he came not to conceal but to confess, and found the old man already gone. He exhaled sharply. We need that timeline nailed down. Sound, travel, light. By mid-afternoon they were once again walking the grounds of the vicarage. Whimsy paced from the back garden gate to the study window, timing each footstep, watching how the fog pooled at the hedgerows. Bunter, dutifully noting the intervals, called out distances and durations. 5 minutes from gate to hearth if... You know the way, Whimsy said. 3 if you're desperate. He paused by the garden wall. And here, someone waited. You can see the moss disturbed. And the marks, my lord, said Bunter, pointing. Not boots, slippers. Whimsy crouched, touched the edge of a faint sole print. A man in indoor shoes, not coming from the road, from within. He left after the fire was tended, but he never used the front door. Inside again, they tested the acoustics. Whimsy stood in the drawing room and asked Bunter to walk down the stair, through the book. Alcove and open the side door. Sound travels oddly here, Bunter noted upon return. The creak of the door doesn't carry. One could move through the house almost invisibly. Exactly, said Whimsy. Now, let's place that sound. At 8:05. Mrs. Manley thought she heard a creak, then dismissed it. She was in the pantry. She assumed it was a beam settling. It wasn't, said Bunter. No, it was Thomas Leyburn. By evening, Whimsy was writing letters of his own. One to the Bishop of Worplesdon, who, being an inveterate meddler and lover of genealogies, might recall a Leyburn or two. another to a solicitor in Bournemouth inquiring whether the Leyburn estate had ever officially settled, and a third, more delicately phrased, to Judith Fellows. He waited until dusk before calling on her again. This time she opened the door without surprise. "You know," she said quietly. "I suspect," he corrected, "but I must confirm." She led him in, her hands tighter than before. "Thomas came back 3 weeks ago. He's not well. He said he needed absolution. I told him not to go to Septimus. I begged him, and he went anyway. Yes, I think he just wanted to be seen, to say sorry. But when he got there..." She stopped. "He found him dead." Whimsy nodded, "and tried to erase the trace of your letter." She sank into a chair, her composure collapsing. "He meant no harm. He was scared. He still thinks in shadows. Egypt ruined him. He didn't kill Septimus, Lord Peter. He didn't." "No," Whimsy said gently. "I don't believe he did." He rose and placed a hand lightly on the back of her chair. "But he may yet be in danger, because someone else may have seen him that night, and they have far more to lose than a tarnished memory." She looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean," said Whimsy, "that while Thomas was busy erasing a lie, someone else was quietly constructing one. And now we must find out which of Septimus's flock feared the truth enough to kill, and let a madman take the fall." As he stepped out into the darkening lane, a breeze stirred the ivy on the vicarage wall, and somewhere in the stillness behind him, Ozymandias gave a single, resonant yowl, as if reminding the village that no secret stays buried forever, not even in a grave as silent as the one Septimus Pendlebury now occupied. The wind picked up as Whimsy returned to the vicarage, pulling autumn leaves into eddies along the garden path. They skittered around his feet like restless secrets, unwilling to settle. He paused briefly at the threshold before stepping inside, where Bunter had, with ecclesiastical reverence, prepared a tray of late supper and set a lamp aglow beside the escritoire. Whimsy did not sit. He walked instead to the fireless grate, now scrubbed of the last ambiguous ash, and stared into it as if it might still contain something worth hearing. "Thomas Leyburn," he said at last, quietly. "A man more ghost than villager. If the past had fingerprints, Bunter, his would be all over this house." "Yes, my lord," Bunter said, placing a decanter with characteristic gravity. "And yet they would hardly show up under powder." Whimsy gave a soft, almost affectionate snort. "What we need isn't residue, but motive. Why did Septimus keep his doors locked in his final days? Why did he break decades of ritual, tending a fire and writing after dark? Something shifted. Something frightened him or compelled him. And Catherine's name, I believe, was the spark." He walked to the writing desk, opening the lower drawer where an untidy mass of sermon notes lay in fading ink. Beneath them, a small sheaf of papers tied with faded green ribbon. Letters. Old. The topmost bore the date 1911. "Ah," said Whimsy, drawing it out. "Now we begin to see." He unfolded the sheet, handling it with care. "My dear Septimus, I know it was wrong to speak so plainly at the vestry, but I cannot endure the idea that your silence implies consent. If your conscience cannot admit what we are, then you must admit that you were part of it too. My father suspects, though I've said nothing, but I cannot marry Charles, not with your silence wrapped around my throat like a stole I never asked." For the signature was simply C. Catherine Leyburn loved him, Whimsy murmured, or at least believed herself bound to him in a way that made another life impossible. And he buried it, chose the cloth over the woman, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of guilt. He flipped through 2 more, each progressively sharper, more wounded, one torn, one unopened. "Now imagine," Whimsy said, pacing, "that, in his old age, this lonely man, certain of his spiritual rectitude and daily habits, is delivered a letter in that same hand, saying she forgives him, wants to speak again. Of course it shakes him. And then," Bunter said, stepping forward, "someone else discovers that letter, someone to whom the past means scandal, not reconciliation." "Indeed, but not Judith. She wrote it, not Thomas. He found Septimus too late. Someone else." He turned to the decanter and poured a small measure. "The answer, I suspect, lies in money. It nearly always does when the spiritual begins to rot. They made inquiries the next day, discreetly, among those who had handled the vicarage's finances. Septimus had a modest living but no great estate. His only beneficiary, according to the church register, was a trust established for a convalescent home, a local initiative with board members, including the late Reverend himself and Mr. Oswald Plimpton. Wimsey met Plimpton that afternoon, pretending to ask about the parish gardens. Plimpton, a gaunt man with a gardener's fingernails and a solicitor's gaze, was affable but not relaxed. Septimus was an old friend, he said, offering lemon tea in an aggressively spotless parlour. Took his duties seriously. Didn't say much about his personal affairs. Not even about the Leyburns, Wimsey asked casually. Or Catherine. Plimpton's eyes flickered. Good heavens, no. Ancient business all forgotten. Until a letter arrived, Wimsey said, and was read by the wrong man. He set his cup down. You see, Mr. Plimpton, someone in this village realized that Septimus might alter his will, or at least his loyalties, if reconciled with that ghost. Someone who stood to gain from his rigidity, and who feared its collapse. Plimpton smiled, but his lips were pale. You think I killed him? I think, said Wimsey, that you interfered. Perhaps found the letter, perhaps confronted him, but I don't think you meant to kill him. Not quite. There was a silence. Then Plimpton rose, walked to the window, and said, not to Wimsey, but to the glass, he would have changed everything. Given the home over to Catherine's cause, or to a fund in her memory, I knew that once he remembered her, truly remembered, it would be over. So you tried to frighten him, or remind him of the cost, and he collapsed. Right. There by the fire, I didn't touch him, but you cleared the desk, adjusted the clock, locked the doors. Yes, Plimpton said, because it looked like guilt, like something I'd caused. Which perhaps I had, Wimsey's voice softened. And the letter? Burned. I thought that would be the end. Wimsey stood. You were right about one thing, it was the end, but not for Septimus alone. They parted with a nod, one that bore no forgiveness, only mutual understanding. When Wimsey returned to the vicarage, he found Bunter beside the hearth holding the cat in one arm and a sealed envelope in the other. This came for you, my lord, delivered by hand. Wimsey opened it slowly. Inside, a single sheet, unsigned. Forgive me for the silence, the fear, the rearranging of truth. Let the dead rest, but let the truth walk at last. He folded it and stared into the fireless grate. Even the guilty long to be heard, he said. Then he bent, gently took the cat from Bunter's arm and placed it back upon the chair. Ozymandias, curling once more, let out a sigh deeper than any sermon, and Wimsey, with a weariness only the absolution of logic can bring, poured a final drink. The following day was unusually still. Even the crows on the chapel roof had the decency to quiet themselves, as though the village of Little Brackenby, having been made to confront the sharp angles of its past, now held its breath for the full reckoning. Lord Peter Wimsey rose earlier than usual, declining his breakfast in favour of a walk beneath the hazy grey sky. His stride methodical, yet unconsciously swift, like a man moving toward something inevitable. It was just before 9 when he stopped, at the cottage of Miss Judith Fellows. She opened the door without surprise, still in her housecoat, the hint of sleeplessness in her eyes, betraying a long night's vigil. She said nothing at first, simply stepped aside, and allowed him in. Received your note, she said once the door had closed behind him. Did you mean it? That he didn't kill him? I did, Wimsey said gently. But Thomas isn't the end of it. He was only the hinge. She poured coffee that neither of them touched. Her hands trembled once, setting the cup down. Wimsey watched her carefully. I spoke with Oswald Plimpton, he said. He found the forged letter, confronted Septimus. It triggered the collapse, quite literally. But it was not malicious, merely, as most such things are, cowardly. Judith nodded slowly. Then, is that it? Not quite. Because Plimpton didn't clear the desk. She looked up, startled. He burned the letter, yes, but he didn't touch anything else. He left the scene panicked, thinking Septimus had only fainted, or that perhaps he'd revive. But by the time the body was found, the letter drawer was empty. That came later. I don't understand. No? Then let's look again. He stood, walking to the window. Someone entered the vicarage after Plimpton left. Not to kill, but to search, to retrieve something. And they left something behind instead, something they didn't mean to leave. He turned to face her. The clock, Miss Fellows. It wasn't just adjusted, it was cleaned. The dust around the hinges, recently wiped. The drawer, too, smudged with lavender polish. She said nothing, but her face had turned pale. Your cleaning cloths smell faintly of lavender, and your shoes, well, one could still find cinders on the right sole if one looked closely. I didn't mean to, she whispered. I know. I came after I saw him walking away. Plimpton. I waited. The house was quiet. I had to be sure the letter was gone. I thought if someone else found it, Thomas might be blamed. Again. She looked at him, suddenly desperate. He can't survive another accusation, Lord Peter. He barely survived the first. Whimsy's voice was soft but unyielding. What was the first? She hesitated. Catherine's death, she said. You know the story, don't you? That she died of influenza in Bournemouth. I know the official story. Judith swallowed. Hard. She didn't die of illness. She took her life. Because the man she loved chose the church, and her brother, Thomas, had warned her. He told her not to put all her hope in Septimus. They argued. She left a note blaming him. Her father suppressed it. Told the coroner it was pneumonia. Moved them all out of Brackenby. Except Thomas. No, she said. He was sent abroad, to Egypt, a kind of exile, and when he returned he never spoke again of her. Until the day I used her name. Whimsy leaned forward. That's why you wrote the letter, not just to comfort Septimus, to redeem Thomas. She nodded. And that's why you entered the house, to take the letter back before anyone else saw, to preserve the fiction that Catherine had forgiven. I cleared the drawer, she whispered. I wiped the clock. I thought it would help. I didn't know he was already dead. I thought he might be asleep. Whimsy sighed. It wasn't murder, Miss Fellows, not in the traditional sense, but it was deceit. And if someone else had come in later, believing your rearrangement to be concealment of a crime, imagine the damage. She looked up at him. Will you tell them? No, he said. Not unless I must. She closed her eyes. Thank you. But, he added, standing, if Thomas Leyburn is to be protected from suspicion, you must help me clear him fully and publicly. That means telling the inspector exactly what you did and when. Judith nodded slowly. I'll write it out. I think that would be best. As he left, Whimsy passed again by the vicarage, now closed, empty, and filled with the scent of cooling stone and scorched memory. Ozymandias was curled unperturbed on the window ledge. He opened one eye at the sight of the visitor, then turned his face toward the interior as though to say, all witnesses grow tired. Eventually, back in the parlor, Bunter was reviewing a collection of notes and letters retrieved from the solicitor's office. Among them, an unsigned document, unfiled and unfinished, written in Septimus's hand. If reconciliation is possible, then I will revise the trust to support the proposed school for girls. Catherine always wanted that. She believed in minds, not merely morals. So it was Catherine's cause, Whimsy murmured, and not Plimpton's sanitarium after all. He tapped the edge of the page. A double life indeed. A vicar who once loved, a teacher who once forged, a brother who once was buried and returned unseen, and a truth everyone tried in their own way to protect. But protection, Bunter, is rarely without cost. Will you hand it over, my lord? I think, Whimsy said slowly. We'll send it to the bishop, with an unsigned note suggesting it was found among old correspondence. Let the trust be resolved in her name, as it should have been. And the case? Whimsy folded his arms behind his back and looked toward the church steeple, rising now against a pale, hopeful sky. Closed, Bunter. Not by justice exactly, but perhaps by mercy. The cat blinked in the afternoon light, and the village exhaled. That evening, As dusk bled gently across the sky like wine spilled on linen, Lord Peter Wimsey returned once more to the vicarage, not as an investigator, but as a man laying the final pieces of a private, painful history to rest. The silence of the house greeted him like a confidant, too weary for further conversation. Its hallways dim, its hearth cold, its air faintly scented with old hymn books and lavender polish, a scent that now carried a burden of truth rather than deception. In the drawing-room, the lamp glowed low beside the escritoire. Wimsey lit a second beside the hearth, its light warming the cat's fur. Ozymandias stretched without interest, entirely undisturbed by the slow machinery of human resolution. The stage was nearly set, by arrangement, carefully constructed and delivered by Bunter with uncharacteristic tact. Those still touched by the affair began to arrive. Inspector Tewkesbury entered first, his brow already furrowed with expectation. He had, Wimsey noted, begun to suspect the need for theatrics the moment he received a note that said only, "I request your presence at the late vicar's study. No arrests, only illumination." Miss Fellows arrived next, pale but composed, a slim envelope in hand, her statement already signed and dated. She did not meet the inspector's eye. Then came Oswald Plimpton, looking greyer than ever, his posture defensive but not defiant. And lastly, to everyone's surprise, Thomas. Leyburn himself, tall, quiet, almost spectral in the doorframe, led gently by Judith's arm. He had shaved for the occasion, though his collar was mismatched. His eyes held nothing of madness, only exhaustion. Wimsey waited until they were seated, the room hushed except for the soft tick of the grandfather clock, still 10 minutes off. "Is customary," he began, "in cases of murder, though this is not quite one, to arrive at a solution via confession, confrontation, or calculation. In this instance, we shall require a bit of all three." He turned first to Tewkesbury. "You were correct, Inspector. The Reverend Pendlebury did die of natural causes, brought on no doubt by stress, shock, or some latent frailty of the heart. The trigger, however, was a letter," he gestured toward Judith, "forged, not maliciously but misguidedly, in the name of Catherine Leyburn. Meant to comfort, it didn't, it undid him." Judith glanced once at Thomas, then looked down. "The letter was removed," Wimsey continued, "not by its forger, nor by a murderer, but by a man who feared the truth it might awaken. Mr. Plimpton. You found it. You confronted the vicar. You left him alive, or so you believed, and departed. But you could not risk others finding it. So you returned. But someone had come before you." Plimpton stirred but said nothing. Miss Fellows, in her fear for Thomas, entered after you. She wiped the clock, cleared the desk. Not to hide a crime, but to shield a brother from the fallout of a truth long buried. He let the words settle. Tewkesbury looked as though he might object, but held his tongue, waiting. Wimsey now turned to Thomas. "You, Mr. Leyburn, came not to kill, but to ask forgiveness. For your role in Catherine's suffering, for your silence. You found him already fallen, didn't you?" Thomas nodded once. His voice, when it came, was dry, hollowed out. He was lying there, one hand on the fireguard. "I thought he'd fainted. I spoke his name, but he didn't stir. I left." "And where did you go?" "To the church," he said. "I sat in the last pew. I stayed until dawn." Wimsey nodded. No deception, no violence. Just layers of fear and shame, built like a tomb over truth. He returned to the center of the room. But one more figure remains. Not a killer, not a conspirator, but a victim of a mission. Catherine Leyburn herself. Her death was not influenza. As reported, it was despair, the despair of abandonment, of disavowal. She believed herself betrayed by love and isolated by family. He picked up the sheaf of old letters from the desk. These are her letters to Septimus. He kept them all, including one unopened, unread until last week. He handed it to Judith. She accepted it wordlessly. Her voice was lost to history, silenced by shame. But not entirely. She survives here. And in this house which, if nothing else, must acknowledge what silence cost her. He turned to Tewkesbury. "There is no crime to prosecute, only corrections to make. The trust will pass to the girls' school, as Septimus intended. Either files will show cause of death as natural. And the clock, well, we'll set that right before we leave." Tewkesbury cleared his throat. "You've managed something rare, Lord Peter. Justice without arrest. Whimsy smiled faintly. Not. Quite justice is never so neat. But perhaps we've achieved equilibrium. The guests left slowly, each lost in their own reflections. Judith lingered by the door, waiting for Thomas, who moved with the slow care of a man newly unburdened. When they were alone again, Whimsy turned to the cat. "Well, Ozymandias," he said softly, "you stood guard, but not over crime, over memory." The cat blinked once, then closed his eyes. Whimsy glanced at the fireless hearth. "No need to relight it tonight, Bunter," he said. "The house can rest." The moon had risen cool and deliberate when Lord Peter Whimsy stepped outside into the hush that had finally fallen over Little Brackenby. The church bell gave a reluctant toll, 9 o'clock, lagging as ever behind the official hour, as if it too was reluctant to move the night along. Whimsy breathed in the chilled air, rich with the scent of earth and wood smoke, and walked with a languid purpose toward the rectory path. The revelations had been made, the actors unmasked, the stage disassembled, and yet a faint disquiet stirred. At the edges of his mind, something unaccounted for, some tremor that resisted narrative neatness. Bunter, who followed at a respectful distance, said nothing, but handed him a folded paper, the final reply from the Bishop of Worplesdon, whose hand had once guided Septimus through his early theology, and whose memory, it seemed, remained sharper than either of them expected. "My dear Whimsy, you inquired regarding the Leyburn family and their history with Pendlebury. I must confess, I had hoped that old wound had scabbed over by now." The Reverend Pendlebury's refusal to officiate at the wedding of Catherine Leyburn and a certain Charles G., name redacted for propriety, was the subject of some ecclesiastical muttering at the time. It was whispered, never confirmed, that Septimus had expressed private objections, not to the marriage but to the bridegroom's interest in parish funds. Some years later, the same Charles was quietly removed from diocesan accounts after a review of misallocated stipends. I do not say there was guilt, but there was movement. Yours in some dismay, Worplesdon Whimsy read it once, twice, then stopped under the stone arch of the church gate and gave a short, cold laugh. "Not jealousy," he said aloud, as if mocking his earlier assumptions. "Not virtue, just arithmetic." He turned to Bunter. "The man Catherine was pushed to marry, Charles G., was a would-be embezzler. Septimus knew, that's why he stopped the wedding. But he said nothing, because to say it would mean revealing Catherine's trust had been misplaced, and perhaps his own. So she thought he abandoned her for doctrine. And he let her think it," Whimsy said, voice quiet. "To spare her or himself, or both." He resumed walking. "We thought Septimus chose celibacy over love, but no. He chose silence, out of protection or cowardice, and by the time he considered speaking, it was too late. The woman was dead, her brother exiled, and the story, the true one, buried with her." They reached the lich gate. Ahead the rectory lights flickered faintly, but Whimsy turned instead toward the churchyard. "Ozymandias stood guard," he murmured, as though invoking the cat again. "Not over guilt, over memory, over the cost of omission." He paused by a narrow stone with worn lettering. The Leyburn name was just visible, faded and low. No dates, no epitaph. Just a name, like a whispered apology. "I wonder," he said, "how many crimes in this country are committed not from malice, but from the overzealous preservation of someone else's secrets?" Bunter, after a moment, said, "Nearly all of them, I suspect, my lord, especially the tidy ones." Whimsy nodded, but his gaze remained on the stone. Judith tried to protect Catherine's legacy. Plimpton tried to protect the trust. Thomas tried to protect his sister's memory by disappearing. And Septimus tried to protect everyone by doing nothing. He turned back toward the path. "And nothing," he said softly, "is the most dangerous choice of all. It pretends to be peace, but it only delays reckoning." Later, in the vicarage drawing-room, Whimsy sat again before the cold grate. Bunter entered with the post and laid a final item before him. A small parcel addressed in unremarkable hand. Inside was a single item, the original forged letter, burned at one edge, smudged but legible. "My dear Septimus, I hope time has not turned. My name bitter on your tongue. I was wrong to expect absolution, and wrong not to offer it. But in the years since we parted I have found, if not peace, then distance. And in that distance I have found a place where your memory rests with gentleness. Should you wish to see me, I shall be here, always yours, Catherine. Whimsy held the letter a long time. It was false, yes, but it was beautiful. Perhaps even truer in its way than the real letters Catherine had once sent in anger and despair. A footstep at the doorway. "Judith." "I thought you might want it back," she said. He shook his head. "No, it's yours." You gave her a voice. Again, even if only for a moment, she hesitated, then stepped forward. "Will it stay quiet now?" Whimsy looked at her, then at the hearth, the lamp, the empty chair. "History never stays quiet," he said, "but sometimes it stops shouting." Outside, the wind had stilled. The bells would ring again in the morning, on time or slightly off. The clock would be set right. The fire, left unlit, would cool. The cat, ancient and silent, would resume his post as if nothing had changed, though everything had. And Whimsy, with the weariness that only resolution brings, would pack his coat, his notebook, and the letter not quite written in the right hand, and return to a world where not all truths were kind, but all truths eventually mattered. Lord Peter Wimsey stood by the study window as the first pale light of dawn crept over the rooftops of Little Brackenby. The village was still asleep, save for the occasional crow's caw from the churchyard and the rustle of autumn leaves stirring in the breeze. But within the vicarage a different tension held the air, an atmosphere as fragile and taut as spun glass. He heard the hesitant knock at the door before it opened. Judith Fellows entered, her eyes wide, the usual composure absent. Behind her followed Inspector Tewkesbury, whose expression was that of a man confronting a reluctant truth. "Lord Peter," Tewkesbury began gruffly, "we had to bring her." "The matter cannot wait." Whimsy turned to face them. "Then let us not waste the morning." Judith's lips trembled. I must speak. About the night. About everything." She moved to the armchair by the fire, sitting with an air of vulnerability. That seemed to shrink her into herself. "I lied," she said simply. "About when I was at the vicarage, about what I saw. I tried to protect Thomas, yes. But I also tried to protect myself." Whimsy inclined his head. "Go on." "I was there before the fire was tended, before Plimpton came back. I saw something. I should not have. Something that changed everything." Her eyes were fixed on the fading embers. "I saw Thomas arguing with another man, someone I didn't recognize. They spoke harshly, words like knives. The other man was angry, threatening." Tewkesbury's eyes narrowed. "Did you see who it was?" Judith hesitated. "No. The fog was thick. But he wore a dark coat and spoke with a clipped accent, like, 'Someone not from here.'" Whimsy stepped closer. "And what happened?" They struggled. Thomas tried to pull away, but the man was stronger. "I ran before I could see more. I was too frightened to tell anyone." A silence fell. Whimsy folded his hands. "And you kept this from us?" "Because I was afraid. Afraid the man would come for me next, and afraid Thomas would be blamed for something he did not do." Tewkesbury's voice was hard. "You've delayed the truth long enough, Miss Fellows." She nodded, tears glistening. "I know." Whimsy turned to the window, looking out at the quiet village. "We now have a new player in this tragedy, a man who sought to control secrets through fear." He faced the inspector. "We must find him before he destroys more lives." Hours later, as the village awoke, a search began. The descriptions Judith provided were vague but sufficient to alert the police to a stranger who might be lurking nearby. Yet the man remained elusive, as though he too were a shadow refusing to be captured. Back at the vicarage, the tension was palpable. Plimpton arrived unannounced, face pale and eyes darting. "I heard," he said hoarsely, "that the letter has surfaced again." Whimsy regarded him coolly. "Indeed, it has." Plimpton swallowed. "I admit I was desperate to protect the trust, but I never wished harm to come to Septimus. Your actions, however misguided, have placed lives at risk." Plimpton's jaw tightened. "I am no murderer." "No," Whimsy replied. "But you were part of a chain that nearly broke." The door opened once more. Thomas Leyburn entered, escorted by Bunter. His face was drawn but resolute. "I want to clear my name," he said quietly. To stop the lies. Whimsy nodded. Then we must confront the stranger. That evening, as fog rolled in thick and heavy, Whimsy orchestrated a meeting. In the shadowed drawing room, surrounded by those touched by tragedy, the atmosphere was charged. The stranger was expected to arrive, or so Whimsy hoped. Hours passed. Then footsteps, soft, deliberate, echoed in the hall. A man entered, tall, with a dark coat and a foreign accent that cut through the silence like a blade. "I am Gregory Harlow," he announced. "And I have come to set things right." Whimsy's eyes glinted. "Mr. Harlow, we have questions about threats, about the night Septimus died, about your involvement." Harlow's voice was steady, but his hands trembled. "I was employed by Mr. Charles G., the man Catherine was to marry. I was sent here to retrieve documents that might have compromised him. I met Thomas by accident. We argued. I feared exposure." He paused. "When I returned to the vicarage, Septimus was already dead. I did not kill him, but I was frightened. So I tried to cover my tracks." "And threatened witnesses," Tewkesbury added. Harlow's gaze dropped. "Yes." Whimsy stepped forward. "Why not come forward sooner? Because I feared prison. Because I feared retribution. Because I thought silence was safer. But silence has nearly cost you your freedom," Whimsy said softly. Harlow sagged, the weight of his guilt finally breaking through. "I confess," he said. "I will answer any charge. I have caused enough pain." The room held its breath. As Inspector Tewkesbury stepped forward, "Mr. Harlow, you will come with us." As officers moved to escort the man away, Thomas Leyburn exhaled deeply, relief washing over his face. Judith collapsed into a chair, tears streaming freely. Whimsy stood by the hearth, watching the scene unfold with the quiet satisfaction of one who has at last restored balance. Ozymandias leapt lightly onto the table, eyeing his master with inscrutable calm. Whimsy smiled. "Even the darkest shadows must flee the dawn." And with that, the long ordeal of little Brackenby drew to a close. The morning after the arrest dawned cool and clear, with a soft haze gilding the hedgerows and dew sparkling like scattered diamonds on the grass. Little Brackenby, roused gently from its uneasy slumber, seemed to breathe more freely, as though a great burden had been lifted from its ancient mossy shoulders. Lord Peter Whimsy took his time over breakfast, meticulously slicing his toast and reflecting on the events that had unfolded, with a faint wry smile curling at the corner of his mouth. Bunter moved quietly about the room, preparing to pack their bags. The case had, after all, drawn to a satisfying close. Outside, the vicarage cat, Ozymandias, made his leisurely rounds of the garden, pausing now and then to peer inscrutably at the windows, as if to remind the household that, despite all human efforts, some mysteries remain forever his domain. Whimsy stood by the window, watching the villagers begin their daily routines, the grocer arranging wares, the postmistress sorting, letters, children skipping along the lane. To an untrained eye, all seemed ordinary. But to Lord Peter, the subtle shifts in posture, the tentative nods exchanged, spoke volumes about the newfound relief that whispered through the streets. Bunter approached with the Morning Post, a modest bundle of letters and newspapers. "The local paper has a brief mention of the incident, my lord, though discretion prevails. There is mention of a gentleman named Gregory Harlow being taken into custody, with a promise of further details to follow." Whimsy nodded. "Appropriate. No need to inflame what was, in essence, a tragedy born of human frailty rather than malice." He returned to his seat and unfolded a note penned in familiar, elegant script. It was from Judith Fellows, expressing gratitude for his kindness and discretion, and her hope that the village might soon find peace. "Discretion," Whimsy murmured. "It is the art of keeping secrets without lying, a necessary skill when truth is too sharp for tender ears." He smiled faintly, then glanced toward the empty hearth. "Bunter, ensure the vicarage clock is set correctly this time. Time, after, all must march steadily forward." The housekeeper, Mrs. Manley, appeared just then, carrying a tray with tea and scones. Her expression softened from the stern reserve she had maintained throughout the investigation. "Mr. Whimsy, if I might say, it feels as though the house Itself has sighed for the first time in weeks, she said, placing the tray carefully. Indeed, Mrs. Manley, Whimsy replied warmly, and a house, much like its inhabitants, needs the chance to do so. She curtsied lightly, then added, The cat seems pleased too. He looked toward the window where Ozymandias, now fully stretched and basking in the sun, surveyed his domain with the imperious air of a monarch. Ozymandias, Whimsy said softly. Your vigilance was unmatched, a true guardian even. If your methods remain inscrutable. He leaned back, eyes gleaming with a familiar mischievousness. One must confess I rather envy your detachment. No moral quandaries to trouble your conscience, just the slow, sovereign judgment of a creature who knows the fleeting nature of human folly. Bunter smiled. And yet, my lord, you engage in that folly with no less elegance. Whimsy lifted his teacup in a delicate salute. Touché, Bunter, touché. Later, as they prepared to depart, Whimsy paused in the hall to survey the vicarage once more. The walls seemed brighter, the air less weighted. He felt the subtle satisfaction of a puzzle completed, though, as always, aware that the most intriguing mysteries often lay just beyond the reach of resolution. Stepping outside, the autumn sun bathed the village in gold. He took a deep breath, relishing the crisp air tinged with smoke and earth. With Bunter at his side and Ozymandias watching from the window, Lord Peter Wimsey walked away from Little Brackenby, his mind already turning to the next curious disturbance in the fabric of genteel society. As they reached the bend in the lane, Bunter cleared his throat. My lord, might I say it has been a privilege as ever to serve in such stimulating circumstances, Wimsey grinned. And I, Bunter, to have such an unflappable companion. Now onward to the next adventure, wherever that may lie. He paused, glanced back once more. Remember, Bunter, as Shakespeare said, the web of our life is of a mingled yarn, good and ill together, and it is our job to untangle it knot by knot. The cat, as if in final acknowledgment, leapt down and padded softly after them, a silent sentinel in the fading light. Thus closed the chapter on the mystery of the vicar, the forged letter, and the cat who stood guard, an emblem not just of vigilance, but of the enduring complexity beneath the veneer of polite village life. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lord Peter Wimsey and his faithful valet disappeared into the gathering twilight, ready to bring their particular brand of order to the next shadowed corner of England.